Okay, so now we start with the public event. Welcome, everyone. I would like to give the floor to the chair of the public event, Miguel Maduro.
So my role is that of moderating and trying to steer a little bit the discussion between the three members of this panel. We have from the left Paolo Cesarini, that is the head of unit Media Convergence and Social Media of the European Union. We have on my left Madeleine de Kock-Buning, that is a part-time professor here at the School of Transnational Governance, but she is also very known, well known, as the chair of the high-level group on misinformation. And on my right I have Robert Post, well known for those of you that are lawyers like me, very well known constitutional scholar and also former dean of Yale Law School, and a great expert on free speech in particular. So we start with Madeleine, and Madeleine, perhaps you can, I mean, this is the public part of an event that took place all day, and that it also explains why all of us may be a little bit tired at this point, because we've been since 9 a.m. in the morning, and the strict discipline, guidance, and hard-working methods of Madeleine discussing on the topic of misinformation precisely, but this is the public part of the event, the rest of the event that brought together academic experts, researchers, people responsible for media bodies, regulatory bodies, for media companies, for digital platforms, from public institutions. That we are all here together discussing the Chatham House rules until this moment. From this moment on, we are talking on and talking publicly. And perhaps, Madeleine, you can start by saying a few words of what we discuss in general, and also talk a little bit about the strategy that has been followed in Europe, on which the report of your high-level group was extremely important.
Thank you so much. This is an almost impossible task, as you can imagine. We had this wonderful group of experts around the table coming from a lot of different disciplinaries, and we had a very complex but extremely inspirational and fruitful discussion. So I'm very happy to share whatever comes out of that with you as the public. And the topic of today was online disinformation ahead of the European Parliament election towards societal resilience. Because what we know is that fake news or disinformation, the word we like much better because it is not so misused as fake news sometimes is by some leaders, world leaders most notably, is that it's of all times, but most importantly is to create societal resilience. And we spoke about, well, how societal resilience became a bit weaker because there's a loss of faith in institution, loss of faith in media, and this is an extremely important part. And we also, if we talk about disinformation, we do not talk about illegal content. So we do not talk about defamation or hate speech, incitement to violence. We just speak about that, what we call disinformation. That is information that is, well, created and purified and spread to change the public opinion on the one hand, and on the other hand, to gain profit by monetizing fun and interesting news. Well, whatever it is, either it's influenced by hybrid threats by the Russians, or it's just clickbait, it is a very important topic of this society at this moment in time. It encompasses a spectrum of information types, from low-risk forms of clickbait to intentional attempts to corrode trust in our democracies, the latter sometimes by means or techniques that are extremely sophisticated and based on well-orchestrated plans by foreign states and local groups. So you can imagine that it was a very wide span of topics we had to talk about today, but it was very good to talk about them both, because then you also work much more on the societal resilience element. Luckily, the evidence we have so far from research, for instance, by Oxford Reuters, is that the direct impact of disinformation on political decision-making is not alarming yet, with an emphasis on yet, because we cannot be sure at all whether that will not be the case in the future. One needs to take into account that accusations of fake news are frequently heard in an indiscriminate way and have become themselves a tool of delegitimization as different sides attempt to impose their own narrative. And this is also a very important element with regard to the discussion on societal resilience against disinformation, we also see that the more emphasis is put on fake news or disinformation, the bigger the fear of society is for this, and then you might in fact create a self-fulfilling prophecy. And then you have distrust in media, and it is distrust in media in a general way that is really detrimental to the function of the watchdog that media has or will have to have as a watchdog for democracy. So we need really the media to be in a position that they can fulfill the watchdog role properly. Well, if we look back at last year, it was only a year ago when we, with the high-level group on disinformation, started our work. And a lot of things have happened since then. I summarized in the beginning of the conversation of this morning that we had the high-level report, then we had the communication of the European Commission a few months later, then we had a code of practices that was a result also of the 10 key principles that we already agreed upon within the high-level group of disinformation, because for your information, this was a very diverse group that included also the platforms, and that they were held accountable for many important things to do, and they already agreed upon those 10 key principles. They further worked on those principles in the code of practice, and now, you know, we are in the stage. Last week, we had the first report out of the results of this code of practices. And what we saw is that the platforms actually take action, but that this action is not wide enough, not deep enough, and especially the fact that they lag behind in research and in not sharing the data that they could actually share. That's one of the largest challenges right now with regard to that code. At the same time, we saw in last December, that there was an action plan coming out from the Commission that was very much focused on hybrid threats, so on Russian propaganda, and that also held forms of, well, giving the European story an opportunity to counter the disinformation that is spread by Russian propaganda, as it is at least stated in the action plan. It also provides for a rapid alert system where platforms are supposed to communicate in a very effective way with the Ministry of Foreign Affairs to find out what kind of disinformation stories are going on. We had some discussions with regard especially to this last action plan in our first session, because we were today doing our discussions in 4 different sessions. The first one was on the fundamental rights context. There was some worry by people that, especially that rapid action, alert action could amount to forms of censorship. And then we concluded that as long as it isn't with regard to the content, but with regard to fake sites, which is just a site that is, well, imposing to be, for instance, a newspaper site, then you could do something about it. But with regard to content, we agreed completely around the table that content should not be decided upon whether something is fake or not by private institutions, so not by Facebook and Google or Twitter, and also not by governments. We find it extremely important that that will not happen. But then the question emerged in this discussion is there a fundamental right to fact-check correct information? Because it's important for people in democracies to make up their mind and to find out what kind of information they have, and if that is correct or not. And we, around the table, were all of the opinion that there is no such thing as a right to correct information. However, there is a right to information, and it is up not to private actors or public actors, but it is, at the end of the day, up to the citizens themselves to decide whether information is correct or not. That is at the core of the democratic debate. So that was something which was really very good. It's up to citizens, and I don't know whether you've seen our wonderful poster on this, to decide whether something is fact or fake. What we also discussed, and Miguel did bring that up, is that the role of courts and jurisdictions is very important in that respect, because if citizens are sued to counter claims of disinformation and they have to go to courts in the US, it will not be affordable for them to do that. So that the matter of jurisdiction is also very important in this respect. So in short, this was what we discussed on the fundamental rights perspective. It was a very complex but very useful discussion. So then the second session was also important. It was on media literacy, and what we, as we also have concluded in the high-level group on disinformation, concluded on media and information literacy, is that also media and information literacy is not the silver bullet. In fact, against disinformation, there is no silver bullet. And media and information literacy is extremely important for the creation of societal resilience. It should be focused towards the recipient of the information. So we very much spoke also about how you could, put the message in such a way that the recipients, both young and older, actually get the information that they need to get. It should not be top-down. We had a very nice example of the a German regulatory authority that created the safe click as a media and information literacy through influencers, so to reach out for young people to be interested in media and information literacy. What they do is they ask influencers, social media influencers, to spread the word on media and information literacy. But in the media and information literacy, it is extremely important not just the media and information literacy towards the citizens, but we have to be aware of the context. The context of the whole discussion of disinformation is that there is a larger and larger distrust in institutions, on the one hand, but also a larger and larger distrust in actual professional media. I don't want to say traditional media, but professional media, because what we have seen is that even traditional medias can be purifier of disinformation. Why? Because they do not have a lot of time to check messages, and that makes it very difficult for media and information literacy if there is not media to be trusted where to refer to. So media and literacy can only function if you look at the one that received the message, but also work on the context in which you bring the message of media and information literacy. And then Facebook came up with, because Facebook was around the table but need to get a plane, but they were very vocal in the discussion, what was very good, I think. And they, of course, received some pushback, but that's part of the deal, I guess. They're used to that. And they said, well, what we have 10 tips to find out whether something is fake news. And we have put that in the media and information literacy libraries to do that. Well, then I took the prerogative as the chair of today's meeting, and I warned for something. We need to be extremely careful for the backfire of media and information literacy. Because if we push too much the message, wow, there can be fake news around, then you will generate a general distrust in media, and this would be extremely detrimental to the role of media as a watchdog in our democracy. So this was the last takeaway of the session of media and information literacy. Then the third session, also extremely relevant with regard to the societal resilience against disinformation, was media pluralism. Because if you have strong and diverse media, then disinformation is diluted because everyone can put information in a context. So that is very important. But what we saw on the one hand is that if you look at the offer side of this of media, that media suffer right now because there is a very competitive advertisement model that makes it very difficult for media to survive. So we see things going down for media with that respect. And on the other hand of the discussion, we see that the algorithms of the platforms actually make people be part of an information bubble. So we also have to take care of watching out that people not only that there is not just a diverse media landscape with strong media, but we also have to make sure that this is actually consumed. And then again, you will see a relationship with the media and information role. Well, talking about the resilience of media against this new models, advertisement models of the large platforms that steal away a lot of their advertisement cost. We've seen some data of the Center for Media Pluralism and Media Freedom that is also here located in the EUI, and we saw that it is in fact Facebook still making a lot of profit. And that media companies are suffering much more. So we started talking about business models, because if you want to have that diverse media, how can they do that? Mark Zunderman of Bertelsmann told us it's a way of trial and error. We try all kinds of different competitive models to be somehow near what the platforms actually are able to get as a revenue. We looked at the role of data, because of course if media institutions or media companies are able, or journalists are able also to have have data in a way of targeting their media, they can steal back a little bit of the advertisement incomes, but we're not there yet. We talk about the role of copyright, because copyright is also very important to get back some revenues, not just for the media companies, but especially for the journalists that now have to work under very, very difficult circumstances. We spoke about media concentration, which is very important as well. For the diversity, it should be watched out in a proper way, but we should also look into the role of regulatory authorities. We have right now still the chair of ERGA around the table, Lubos Kuklish, and he told me that it is very important also for the regulatory authorities to keep a good eye on market concentrations and to look into the implementation of the Audiovisual Media Service Directive for video sharing platforms. Maybe you know that the end of last year we have now a new directive on audiovisual media services, and this gives extra rules for video sharing platforms, hopefully creating a more of a level playing field. So, then we spoke about the risk of public intervention, because public intervention and state aid for media can be a very, a good way forward to support the media. But of course, the biggest risk there is the independence of media. You have to do it in a very smart way. We had an excellent example by our director, Miguel. He came up with the idea of the citizen credit. So the citizen would get a credit of €3 per period, and then he could buy access to the information he or she wants. And that's the best way to avoid that there is some interference in the content of the information. Another good example was the training of journalists. You can support journalists in training. You can also support innovation and tools for journalists to fact check their information. And at all times we have to avoid a mix of sponsored and editorial content, because at the end of the day, if that will be happening, then media cannot play that role either. So then we had Facebook telling us about a very interesting but also a bit scaring idea of how they are helping journalists to train them to be more popular or more successful on social media. And then we tried to find out what Facebook was actually doing there, and well, it seemed that they just helped journalists to be higher on the timeline of on the success rate of Facebook. And when we questioned ourselves, would that then create a race to the bottom, because if you would have like a really cool title to an article, then you would have more interest, of course, and more clicks, more advertisement revenues, but on the other hand, that would be very detrimental to the trust in media in general. So that is also very interesting. So the public and the private aid to media should be taken up very diligently. Then the last, and maybe for us here at EUI, STG, and also with all the academics around the table, most important element was that we spoke about the role of academia, about research. Because what is, of course, most crucial is that we keep to check whether what measures we take, the advice of the high-level group, the steps that have been taken after that, whether that's actually working. So you need to create a feedback loop for future-proof solutions. But then you have to, and this is something, well, EUI and especially STG focuses on, to have a good communication, fruitful discussion and input from academia, research, to policymakers. And that is extremely important. We also concluded that, this is such a multidimensional issue that you would need multidisciplinary teams to help solve them. But how? Because it's a long time issue for academics to communicate with those that are from a different disciplinary. We spoke, for instance, about people from the economic faculty that speak to lawyers, but also think of scientists, data scientists, informatics, mathematicians, to talk to social scientists, for instance. So that is not an easy way to go forward. We also spoke about the great advantage of colliding and really discussing and fighting with each other, but at the end of the day, it is up to us academics to explain in a very clear and lucid way for policymakers what steps to take up. Well, so research is almost, yeah, don't worry, almost ready. Research is so important to keep on doing that, not just on fact-checking, but also on how this information is spread, who it is targeted at, and all those elements should be taken up. And we will be discussing on that in the near future. And now I will stop and give the floor to the chair.
Thank you, Madeleine. Now next, Robert, and I will ask both you and Paulo to be slightly shorter than the chair of the event, but also because I think we should give the opportunity to those around the table and those also up there if they want to put some questions to the three of you. So Robert, maybe you can somehow compare the debates taking place in the United States with the approach and what you saw and heard here today in Europe. But also, I think it would be very interesting if you could develop a point you made this afternoon, that is that, in your view, to a large extent, this issue has been dealt often as an epistemological problem, and the new ways through which people try to find what is the truth. And instead, for you, it's more of a problem that regards the loss of trust in sources of authority to define what the truth is that we no longer have. And the extent to which those two things are different require different answers, and the extent to which that means that we've been misguided in the way that we face this problem.
Thank you, Miguel. So I just want to express my gratitude for being here at this wonderful discussion today. It was remarkable. I come from a country that has elected a president whose legitimacy is open to question because of the intervention of disinformation. And my country, the administration hasn't recognized this as a problem, has done zero to combat it. And here I am in Europe where you have, with the speed of light, identified the problem, put into place an action plan, are responding to it. It's astonishing to witness from my side of the pond, and it's a great thing, and I congratulate you all on your ability to recognize an issue and to formulate an action plan to respond to it. So I'm going to give some reactions to the plan that I see that you have made. My specialty is freedom of speech. And the first question is, of course, why you have freedom of speech. You have it typically in most countries in the world. You protect freedom of speech because you want a society in which the government is responsive to the people. So how is the government responsive to the people? It's responsive to public opinion. If the state can create public opinion, it's no longer responsive to public opinion. And the implication of that is that people must be free to contribute to public opinion and in that way have the freedom of speech necessary to sustain a democracy. That's the point of freedom of speech. And to the extent that that's true, you really don't want the government and you don't want private parties regulating public opinion. You want the people themselves to be able to do it. That's the general point. And that seems to be a cardinal principle in the way you formulated your response to the problem, and I applaud you for that. I think it's exactly right. So it's in that spirit that I want to point out some aspects of the way in which you've gone about to formulating the problem that might call into question some of the precise technical ways in which you've thought about the issue. So the first question is, this is a problem of disinformation. What is disinformation? What do we mean by disinformation? So if I look at the high-level report, it says, we define disinformation as false, inaccurate, or misleading information designed, presented, and promoted to intentionally cause public harm or for profit. So most states in the world regulate information that's false, flat out false. Falsity in the context of defamation in many contexts is regulatable because presumably courts are able to decide whether the traffic light was red or green when there was a traffic accident, so they determine the truth or falsity of factual propositions about the world. When we start talking about information that's misleading, we're talking about something else entirely. In the United States, we regulate misleading information in the commercial context, but never in the political context. Because misleading information is that information which, when interpreted from the point of view of the audience, can be misunderstood. And that gives enormous leeway to the regulator. So let me give you a simple example. If I say to you, Turin is the capital of Italy, you say to me, that's false. And it's a factual proposition, I can look it up. But suppose I say to you, actually, the real capital of Italy is Brussels. Right? It's factually false. Is it misleading? Is it true? What am I doing there? I mean, it requires enormous interpretive capacity to understand what is misleading, what isn't misleading. It gives enormous leeway to the regulator. And so the minute you put misleading into there, you are creating the potential for great regulation for whoever the regulatory body is. Now, that translates in the protocol that the various platforms were required to sign in very interesting ways. I read this as an American, right, committed to the First Amendment, which from the European point of view is crazy, but nevertheless, whatever insights it can bring to bear, I'm going to bring them to bear to you. So it doesn't talk so much, the protocol, about false information, and I think probably correctly, because it doesn't want Facebook to be determining what's false for the rest of us to read, nor does it want the state to come in and say, that's false, you know, don't say that about Brussels because that's false. Instead, look at the language which is in the protocol. I'm reading now from it. It says, the signatories of this code recognize the importance of diluting the visibility of disinformation by improving the findability of trustworthy content and consider users should be empowered with tools enabling a customized and interactive online experience so as to facilitate content discovery and access to different news sources. So on the one hand, that's a commitment to pluralism. That's fine. That's content neutral. But what do we mean by trustworthy content? So one understanding of trustworthy content just goes to falsity, namely, I say I'm President Trump, but I'm not really President Trump. It's false. It's just a false fact. But the way I read trustworthy content, and particularly in the context of other provisions in the protocol. Trustworthy content is content which isn't misleading, which is from a source that doesn't have an interest in telling you that Brussels is really the capital of Italy. So we see language like transparency should reflect the importance of facilitating the assessment of content, that's of content, through indicators of trustworthiness of content sources. That sounds like trustworthiness of the source, not whether the source is false or true. Now, what has happened here is that the idea of falsity has metamorphosized, has transformed into the idea of trustworthiness. That's a really interesting transformation from my point of view, because what makes for knowledge is trustworthiness. And we're talking now about the movement of information just from an information environment to that information which I'm willing to accept as true, that is to say that I know it. What's the definition of true knowledge? You know, an analytic philosopher will tell you warranted true belief, but in the real world, none of us know what's actually true. We know what's warranted. And what's the definition of warranted? I'm willing to act on it. I'm willing to stake my future on acting as if this was true. And we call such things, in retrospect, knowledge. And another way to put that is that I trust it to be true. I trust the source to be true. Enlightenment epistemology was based on the fact that science, all of us can recapitulate science. We can redo the experiments. Each one of us can prove for ourselves whatever is said scientifically to be true. We all know because of specialization that's not true anymore, right? I take everything I know about health science on trust. I go to my doctor and he tells me or she tells me, and then I know it's true. She tells me, vaccinate your child. And if I suddenly don't trust the doctor, I don't know what's true about vaccination. How am I going to know what's true about vaccination? So trust and knowledge go together, which is why trustworthiness is in this protocol. Now, what do we think about trustworthiness? What is that kind of concept is that? I want to suggest to you it's a political concept at root. It's a political concept about who I'm willing to depend upon. And to me, the analogy of our present state of affairs goes back to the Reformation. The Reformation came about because information suddenly became much cheaper with the invention of the printing press. And so suddenly you didn't have to rely on priests to interpret the Bible. You could read the Bible yourself. You didn't have to trust your priest. You could determine for yourself what the gospel meant. And suddenly that leads to an explosion of antinomianism, of anarchy, where all forms of authority became under question. And you had, a century, 2 centuries and a half of war in Europe over the epistemological uncertainty that the cheapening of information by the invention of the printing press caused in Europe. And what the internet has done is it's cheapened the marginal cost of information to zero. And suddenly information has become democratized. And all sorts of people have access to information who never had it before. It's like they could read their own Bible. They can do their own studies on vaccination, and they don't trust anymore the experts, the doctors, to interpret it for them. They interpret it for themselves, and they say, screw you to the doctor, I'm not going to vaccinate my child, and we have epidemics. So the crisis that we're facing is a crisis of the forms of authority that establish knowledge. And that's true in the political sense, but it's also true in the scientific sense. If I think of the archetypical example of this, it's climate change. Where the science is plain enough, qua science, but it's not actually believed. So there are studies in the United States which show that the greater the degree of education of a Republican, the less likely they are to believe that climate change is man-made. So education is doing exactly education is not the answer. Although in our discussion today, we tended to think of media literacy as an educational project as though it would solve the problem. The problem, from my way of thinking, is a political one. It's the political one of authority. Now, that notion is implicit in, but disguised by, the word resilience in the name of today's session. So a society of resilience is one presumably that retains the Enlightenment commitment to reason. Well, a commitment to the Enlightenment project of reason is not a psychological metaphor of resilience. It's a matter of retaining elite control over the thinking of the democratic masses. That's not resilience, that's compliance. And so if we think about this as a matter of restoring to health those who disagree with us and who now are given the power to vote with their internet searches in ways that we find troubling, we're not going to solve this problem. It's not going to be solved by condescension, and it's not going to be solved by simply suppressing the worldview of those who disagree with us, and I personally happen to think are wrong in all sorts of ways. It's a matter of giving us a common stake in a common world. And if we have a common stake in a common world, we will begin to rediscover a common epistemology to achieve our common projects. But the forms of knowledge which flow from that flow from common commitments and common political projects, which makes this ultimately a matter of political stakeholding. And the polarization that we're seeing, and from my point of view, has to do with the loss of that. And ways of solving it short of that are going to run into that problem continuously. Now, there are, the idea of what's common is, of course, created by the world itself. And the world itself is structured. It's not random, and et cetera. And we do have control over the architecture of what people see and do on the internet. We do know, for example, that what people see on Facebook is determined by the algorithm of how they determine the timeline, and what people see on Twitter, similarly, is determined by these algorithms. So one kind of intervention would be actually the algorithms have to be determined by Enlightenment forms of reason. But that would require all forms of content discrimination and state intervention, et cetera, which runs into the problem that we started with. A different way to think about an intervention into those algorithms is to make it pluralist. That is to say, regardless of the content, you are seeing, we know that you are in your bubble, and we're going to create an algorithm which disrupts bubbles. That may backfire, because all of a sudden, you know, climate deniers become in your timeline with with scientists. So who knows what that would do? But that would be a content-neutral way to disrupt the architecture by which bubbles are formed. Or we could sort of say, actually, bubbles aren't just about a matter of information. They're a matter of politics and who you're allied with to attain what, you know, what you get back from the world. And we could intervene politically. But that, of course, probably takes us beyond the subject matter of this particular session. So I'll stop there.
Thank you very much, Robert. Madeleine asked for a 30 seconds reaction on this.
Very short. So nice to hear from you from the American perspective. One thing is the suggestion you come up with pluralistic algorithms. This is exactly what we have advised in the high-level report as an alternative to create that. So break out of the bubbles by offering alternatives under the algorithm.
Even if he's not very much convinced that will work. But anyway, it's a possible alternative. Paulo, maybe you can not only present what the Commission has been doing and the strategy that you're following, but also the extent to which what you heard today may lead you to rethink some of those aspects and
Confess.
Well, yes, indeed it has been extremely interesting. Today it has been an extremely interesting debate. It put the focus on a couple of aspects which, for me, takeaways on which we are going to reflect further. The aspect about pluralism and the determination of the manner in which online services should be structured in a way that pluralism, it is ensured not only on the offline, but also on the online world. It is one point for further consideration, of course, as well as the role of research. I think the latest session we had before this one made very clear that the phenomenon of disinformation is a phenomenon in constant evolution that requires adequate resources to be spent on the observation and to the understanding of the phenomenon as it evolves and as the technology evolves as well. The threats that are posed today by disinformation are very clear in terms of threat analysis to the Commission and to the EU institutions at this point in time. On the 13th of December, the European Council, so the head of states and governments have adopted an action plan that confirms the seriousness of the issue that we are debating today. It put an emphasis, of course, on the increased weaponization of information that becomes increasingly part of hybrid warfare promoted by foreign actors, and lends its hand for very sophisticated interferences in democratic processes, in particular in view of the elections, and the upcoming elections to the European Parliament, you can imagine, are a source of concern, and a moment in which efforts needs to be deployed in order to ensure that the integrity of this electoral process is preserved. The action plan traces 4 main lines of actions, and very briefly I would say that the first 2 lines of actions are about strengthening the institutional capacity to deal with actions that, due to the degree of sophistication and to the influence that is exercised by, in particular, state actors from third countries, requires adequate systems for detection and for exchange of information between public authorities to have rapid systems for response. So at the core of this first part of the action plan, it is the idea to create a contact point between member states, rapid alert systems where exchange of information and coordination of response can take place in real time. On the other side, however, and all the debate today has confirmed that there is a risk in dealing with such a slippery topic, which is disinformation, where, you know, the establishment of facts sometimes is difficult to be distinguished from the interpretation of facts, and the interpretation of facts is difficult to be distinguished from opinions. So between news and views, especially in the context of a society which tends to pay much more attention to the opinions and the views than to the news and the facts and the empirical evidence that support factual considerations, in that particular context it is extremely important to remain cautious and to give the civil society a prominent role in combating this phenomenon. So the second part of the action plan put the emphasis very much on the importance of pursuing a multi-stakeholder engagement process which involves the industry, which involves the civil society, and which involves also the research world. As regards the industry, we have done something, and I want to thank, actually, the acknowledgement of the fact that many steps have been taken at the speed of light during the last year. And one of the main achievements, it is the adoption of a code of practice, what you have called a protocol. It's a kind of self-regulatory response, which the main online platforms have subscribed in the last October. So Twitter, Facebook, Google, and Mozilla have done so, as well as the trade association that represent the advertising industry have also subscribed to this code, and the timeliness of this action has to be seen in view of a number of commitments in this code which are specifically designed to provide remedies to ensure the integrity of the elections, the European elections, which are fast approaching. We have, a couple of weeks ago, received the first reports on the implementation of the code by the signatories. And there are sources of satisfactions and there are reasons for concerns in what we have seen so far. I think in certain areas which are particularly important in view of the elections, there are substantial progress that has been made. Disinformation is not, has been recalled before, a unidimensional phenomenon, but has many facets. one of the facets, it is also to enable citizens and future voters to understand the nature of the content that they access online. So when it comes to political or issue-based sponsored content, it's important that the users understand exactly what type of content they are reading or viewing on their own screens. The creation of transparency tools by Twitter, by Facebook and Google to make plain to everybody, to all the users, what it is a political message which is sponsored, who has sponsored, how much money has been spent, invested for this sponsoring, and what have been the targeting criteria that have enabled this message to reach particular audiences. These transparency measures are well underway. We would wish to see them rolled out fast in all member states, but the starting point is there, and the progress made is quite encouraging so far. It is also encouraging to see that another plague in the information space, in the online information space, which is represented by the interactions, sometimes are human, sometimes are bot-driven, and it's not always clear where the automatic systems intervene and where the human relations actually emerge. Well, these activities to disable actually malicious bots and to close down fake accounts that artificially amplify messages and therefore make people believe that certain narratives are popular, whereas they may not be popular, but simply artificially amplified within echo chambers which are construed purportedly in a sophisticated manner, so that narratives that are deliberately, intentionally construed to mislead the readers. And I'm not talking about the content, which is misleading. I'm talking about the techniques. I'm talking about the behaviors that are implemented in the online space in order to mislead the persons. So this type of conduct, I think it is encouraging to see that this type of conducts are detected and sanctioned by the platforms through the closure of these fake accounts. I want to underline this point because Robert raised this important question about ultimately who is the arbiter of the truth and who is determining what can or cannot be displayed. Here we are not talking about taking down information. We are talking about tracking malicious behavior that it is deliberately construed to make people believe what is in reality, it is not true. But we are talking about behaviors, not content, you see. So that is one point that I want to make in terms of closure of fake accounts. The third, it is about the scrutiny of ad placement. Yeah, how many? 4 minutes. Okay. The other aspect, it is about scrutiny of ad placement. The demonetization of purveyors of disinformation is well ongoing. There's indeed some more to be done, but is ongoing. There are other areas where instead it is not totally satisfactory, also because there are areas particularly difficult to address, which are those measures that would aim at enabling consumers to better understand how to navigate the online information space. And this is very much linked to this issue that you just evoked about the trustworthiness indicators and the issue about the ranking of the content in the news feeds or in the search results on Google. Who is determining the trustworthiness indicators? It's not a decision that can be taken through regulatory actions. It's not a decision that should belong only to the platforms. Nobody is the ultimate arbiter. But certainly, and that is what the Code of Practice invites, it should be the result of a collaboration between the whole media ecosystem and the platforms to determine, on the basis of objective criteria, what are the sources of trust today that needs to be emphasized in the manner in which the algorithms display the content online. And certainly, the first thing is about transparency. Who is the owner of a website that publishes news? Who is the director of the news room? Who are the collaborators in the newsrooms? Where is it established? Who is financing this these outlets. And how many times issues such as right to reply, right to correction have not been correctly applied by this outlet. How many times information which is not factually correct has not been corrected. Those are objective criteria that pertain to correct and good journalistic practices that can be embedded in signals, in trustworthiness indicators, that do not imply an establishment of authorities top-down, but simply requires the application of existing standards for good journalism, journalistic professions, to be translated into machine-readable signals that would actually reorganize the way the content is distributed online, one point, and the second point would also enable the distribution of content that relates to certain topics, particularly the most viral topics, through the simultaneous exposure of information coming from different sources. And here we come to the point about pluralism, how pluralism it is ensured online. And that is very much linked to the implementation of this set of commitments that are not simply trying to establish criteria for truth versus falsehood. They try to establish modus operandi, so operational system that can imply certain changes in the algorithmic choices that are made within the services driven by these major platforms in order to create the condition for application of right, transparent journalistic standards in the outlets that are numerous online and not always intelligible for normal users. And secondly, to have a more diverse and directly linked connections with content that pertains to trending topics. Finally, the final point that I think I take away from this day of discussions, it is the role of multidisciplinary teams and the role of research, because all this links together. And unfortunately, I have to say that there is some road ahead of us that needs to be, still run. The access to data and the usage of data and the centralization of the ownership of data in the hand of few players is certainly a problem that has been widely acknowledged around this table today. And this is the raw material that can fuel real independent research in the future. So there is a responsibility that is incumbent on the platforms in order to disclose this data to enable the research, but there is also a responsibility that pertains to the public authorities, member states and commission alike, but also to the academic world to step up the efforts and to move ahead a redesign of the research programs, projects that put correctly the focus of this information among the priorities that needs to be pursued in the future in terms of multidisciplinary research.
Thank you very much. So Robert actually has a question to Paolo, but let me collect, if you want, 1 or 2 maximum questions and then give the floor to the 3 and the opportunity to Robert who wants to. 1. I will give priority to those that did not participate in the roundtable. So.
Hi, my name is Massimiliano Santini. I'm a fellow here at EY and an economist on leave from the World Bank. I have a question. First of all, thank you so much for sharing your thought. I just joined the dialogue, and it was super interesting to hear all your thoughts. My question has to do with the receiving hands of fake news or facts. As we know from cognitive science, the people are wired up to accept facts if they match with their pre-existing beliefs. And alternatively, they would reject the fact in favor of an alternative fact or a fake news if that is instead in line with their pre-existing beliefs. And so that poses a question of how do we frame facts? What is the environment, the vehicle with which we transmit facts in the public discourse? Then my question is, in your opinion, what would be, who should take the leadership in the public arena in between politicians or journalists, the media, or the civil society to make an effort to change the public discourse and reframe key issues that would allow facts to be better received, better accepted by people. Thank you.
Any other question? Speak now. Yep.
Hi, my name is Alex Burton. I'm from across the pond as well, so I appreciated Professor Post's comments. I'm from the northern part of across the pond. I guess the one thing I would like to hear, I came in part to this talk because of your title, ahead of the European Parliament elections. And while the discussion has been fascinating and we're struggling with how to deal with this, I feel like the presentation has not touched on this, which is a sort of elephant in the room. It's an expression of a concern. Something is happening here, and what are we going to, how are we going to respond to it, or not? And so there was one mention in your talk about information coming from Russia, but I assume that this is of some concern to the panel, that there is something in the zeitgeist or in the internet world that threatens something about the future political events in the near future and in the far future, and I'd love to hear the panel's thoughts on that particular aspect.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much. I'll now give the floor to each of the panel members. Maybe we'll start with, we follow the same order, Madeleine, and each one of you will have 2.5 minutes maximum, because Robert actually has a taxi to take in 11 minutes, 10 minutes.
Would be nice if we could keep Robert a bit longer, though. No, but I keep it very short. So you say the political elections coming up, that's the elephant in the room. But in fact, it was not the elephant in the room. But we took a multidimensional approach towards the elephant. So it is both the hybrid threats coming from Russia, and I think, well, we discussed that, but you also heard Paolo Cesarini talk about that, but it's also like the general distrust there is in media at this moment, and the vulnerability of media and the distrust in institutions. So it is all those things together that make the challenge for democracies to actually function, and the watchdog role of the media being muzzled. And this is why we not just talk about European elections, but also how we create societal resilience in a future-proof way.
Robert, and
okay. From an American point of view, the speed of this action is like remarkable. I mean, the effectiveness of the action is remarkable. But of course, there's a short-term and there's a long-term problem, and you're hearing both here today. First. Second, I just wanted to put a question to Paola about the trustworthiness. So I understand a news site which is not trustworthy in the sense, say, of trademark, because it confuses who the mark is. You know, it purports to be from this, but it's actually from that. I get that, and I get how that can be regulated without conceptual problems. But just put a concrete case to you and tell me how you would handle it under this rubric of trustworthiness when you say objective indicia. So there's a website that is a climate denier, and it keeps denying climate, and it keeps saying things which, from the point of view of any scientist, is irrational, but it keeps saying them. It's not a question of fact or not fact, because these are scientific theories, of course, which are not, strictly speaking, fact. They are more like opinion or theory. How do you handle that in terms of trustworthiness? What's the objective indicia there of good journalism, bad journalism? It's a website that is dispersing climate denial information. How does that get classified in the objective machine-readable data that you want to use to be neutral in the intervention in this space?
Yeah. I will start, since there are several questions, I think. The first one is about the readiness of measures in view of the European elections. It's not at all the elephant on the room. The action plan has been adopted in view of the European elections. So the readiness has to be looked at from the point of view of the system that member states are supposed to put in place. In particular, this coordination mechanism around the rapid alert system that should facilitate situational analysis and threat analysis, and to have a response, therefore, to identify the actors behind and to act in real time. That is a very concrete measure. Of course, involves a level of information that sometimes is classified, involves the hybrid self-fusion, and therefore the intelligence services of the member states, but certainly it has been stepped up in view of the risks that Russian interference could alter certain processes, not only from the information point of view, but also from the cybersecurity point of view. So this is one. And the other thing is about the focus on the main priorities that have been given to the platforms in terms of political advertising, in terms of closure of fake accounts and bots and malicious bots, and in terms of demonetization of bad actors. But all these are being implemented right now, and I have a clear focus on the European elections. Okay. So then there are the longer term issues where there is a question about effectiveness of the remedies, bearing in mind that the confirmatory bias at work that made all this response look a little bit fragile or uncertain. And there are also issues about how to deal with pluralism and how to deal with this fundamental philosophical question, which is who established the trust and how trust can be established in societies where trust is eroded from many different points of views, including inequalities, including, many factors come into play. Now, as regards the bias, about the confirmatory bias, of course, you never change the mind of a full converted. So if you want to believe what you want to believe, you will die believing what you had always been believing during all your life. But that is not the point. The point is that disinformation campaigns try to polarize public opinion by moving the middle ground towards two extremes, whatever it is the extreme. But to remove the incertitude in those areas of the population that still are looking for answers. In the presidential election, for instance, was enough. We don't have the final evidence, but it seems to be proven that about 2% of the persons which were still in this swinging state hesitant about which side to take, a disinformation campaign made the difference. So what we're talking about, it is to avoid that in Europe, this middle ground, people that search for answers, and does not keep shrinking as it is right now doing, but maintains a prominent position at the center, and that requires a number of actions to be put in place in the long run, including more exposure to diverse content online. If the online channel is the preferred channel for everybody, implies good media policy and educational policies in place to maintain civic and also critical spirit across audiences. It requires very carefully designed policies to support the media sector and to support the traditional media and to do the work that is most costly, like investigative journalism. It requires a number of actions. The confirmatory bias cannot be an excuse not to act. It exists, but it cannot be an excuse to say nothing can be done. Then finally, the question on the climate change example. Yeah, it's true, but if you look at the trustworthiness indicators as a set of criteria, take NewsGuard. NewsGuard, what it does exactly that. It takes 9 criteria, 8 of which are based on transparency. 1 is based on accuracy of content. And after a number of observations, classify a source between those who can be trusted and those that you can read, but please proceed with caution. This is what NewsGuard in US is doing. There are other examples of the same. The question is about the calibration of the different criteria, and the criteria needs to be objective. Better if they are based on transparency issues, because there where you capture the behavior and you steer clear from content judgment about content.
I mean, what that leads to, in my view, in this world, in this polarized world, is a regression. Because who trusts the guarantors of trustworthiness? Who trusts the fact checkers? And if you have an initial problem of trust, it can't be solved by saying, you don't trust me, trust her. Madeline is like, no one would distrust Madeline, right? But then it keeps going backwards, and it's the elephants all the way down when you're dealing with the kind of problem we're dealing with. A different kind of solution, and a cleaner solution, would be, if you're worried about foreign interference, in the United States, it's illegal for a foreign power to attempt to influence the outcome of an election. If you had such a law, you could just, if it's traceable, if it comes from a foreign power with the intent to influence an election, you're done, and you don't have to get into anything else.
Yeah, no, the problem...
That's a clean solution.
No, but the solution exists already in Europe. If there are evidence that actions like hybrid warfares of information, disinformation, is of such a level as to affect the integrity of the electoral processes, then it is an illegal action, and therefore it can go to the point to require the takedown of this content, but is linked to public ordinance and public security, which are two principles, as you know, that counterbalance the freedom of expression under the Charter.
Okay, thank you. I felt tempted almost to, but I was going to feed the discussion again, and Robert, you do have to go. And thank you very much to the three speakers and panel members, and thank you very much to all of you for having come. Thank you. Those that came during the entire day to participate in the full day event, and those that came just for the public roundtable. Thank you very much to all.
And thank you, STG, for organizing this in an excellent way. Lisa, for instance, thank you so much. Fiona, but also you, thank you so much, Miguel. And Fabrizio for organizing this. Thank you very much.
Oh, and thank you very much to Fiona. Thank you very much. You did it already? Okay.